All right, so as I was saying, my name's Ethan Bauer. I'm with Golden Ridge Honey out of Cresco, Iowa. Before I get started in this presentation, I want to dive into how I got into beekeeping. I'm only 31 years old, and I've been keeping bees since I was a kid. So it started out with my dad. My dad was a hobbyist beekeeper. He had anywhere from 50 to 80 colonies at one time. And growing up as a kid, I just helped him out in the yards. That's what got me going into bees. I got my passion that way. Fast forward to high school, I was very active in FFA. I did my SAE project on 2 beehives, and that was a neat experience. You know, growing up, I got to actually, not many people kept bees. So with the FFA thing, I got to actually explain it to my friends, and they were wondering what I was doing. And so that was really neat. I got to build my own equipment. They were peeking over my shoulder. Everybody else was doing hay racks and feed bunks and everything like that. And I was in the corner of the shop actually building beehives. So, and so that transitioned on. I was continuing helping my dad through high school. And then it came to be when I needed to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. So I decided to go to NIAC here in Mason, and I took their agricultural program they offered. It was a 2-year course. You got 2 degrees out of the deal, and really intensive agriculture. And I grew up around farming. I grew up on a family farm, but never really got into farming. But I always helped. I was always involved with agriculture. And so when I went to NIAC, I didn't really know what I was going to do, but I knew that if I put in my time, I was going to be in the agricultural industry somewhere. And part of that program was we needed to have an internship. And it got down to the wire, and I really needed to figure out what I was going to do. And lo and behold, I got a call, and there was a beekeeper by Cresco by the name of Manly Beeock, and he was actually looking for help with bees. And so I thought, well, this is an opportunity. So I actually talked to the teachers in NIAC, and they were a little hesitant. They never had anybody bring up, like, do you want to work with bees? You know, most of it was with applicator companies or 5-star, via field, I mean, you name it, especially being around here in Mason, you know. So they said, if it's really something I want to do, then go ahead and try it. So I did. And I went over, had a nice talk with Manly and his wife, Linda Beock. And to make a long story short, they hired me on, and I was 19 years old at the time. And they hired me on for the first internship. I did my second internship, and then after I graduated college, Manly hired me on as a full-time beekeeper. And I owe it a lot to him. I mean, Manly took me under his wing. He had 60 plus years of beekeeping experience. Manly was a huge advocate for the industry. He'd done a lot of stuff out of his own way. Manly specialized in keeping Russian honeybees. He was a big part of bringing these bees over to our country, and he was one of the first members of the RHBA. And it's been around so long that maybe not a lot of people really know about it, but the Russian program was started years ago to come up with a bee that was resistant to Varroa. And, still in today's beekeeping world, Varroa is one of our biggest, issues. And having a bee that was brought over that was, had exposure to mites for years and years and years, and then they found these bees and brought them over, it was a big deal. I mean, people were talking, when Manly first got these bees, he talked with the bees he had, they were crashing by October. And this is when Varroa first come in. And then he devoted his time, switched everything over to Russian, and then all of a sudden he started noticing some changes. And this was back in the early 90s. And so this has been around a long time, and so being a part of the membership, we're basically propagating off of this genetics and making it better and better and better. And so, I can go on and on about that, but that's how I got into beekeeping. And, Manly, I owe the world to him because he gave me the opportunity. I worked for him for 10 years. I worked for him. I kind of joke, I tell people my only coworker for 10 years was a 70 and 80-year-old man. And I worked by his side for those 10 years, and then I got the opportunity to buy the beekeeping business the spring of 2023. And so I purchased the business out, and I've been running it. This will be my 3rd year now in business, and I'm kind of carrying it on, what he started. I'm carrying on the Russian thing. I'm a certified member of the program now. I think there's only 9 of us in the program. We're all scattered out across the country. So these bees are really put into different situations. We got members out in Massachusetts. I'm a member in Iowa. Jason Foley's another member. He's down by Des Moines. There's members in Tennessee. There's members in Mississippi, Alabama. So these bees are really spread out, and they do really well across our country. So that's enough about me. Let's get into the presentation here. So I kind of structured this presentation and timeline on what we're going to be doing as beekeepers in the next few weeks. So we're going to be out checking our colonies come March. Hopefully you guys got out in the last couple of weeks with the warmer weather to check on your bees. Hopefully they look good. It's pretty rare to get that kind of weather at the end of January. So it's pretty good to get out and take advantage of it. Some of the options, the things I look for in the next month here going out in March is going to be checking feed. I start checking my dead outs, I start checking feed. I'm just going to walk through kind of a year on out deal on how I keep these bees and what they can give you. So some of your options, I won't cover these too much because it's pretty basic, but you got dry sugar fondant, your winter patty, combs of honey to feed your bees. I'm a fan of the winter patty. Just for me, it's easy to get it on the bees, get in and out of the hive quickly. The one from Daydant here, I've been using this for 3 years now. It's got a little bit of everything in it. It's got some protein in it, but not enough to really ramp up the brood thing, so you don't have to worry about them getting too light. It's got Honeybee Healthy in it. I see a lot of stimulation with it, so I'm a fan of that. This time of the year in March, the biggest concern is checking your feed, and that's with any bee. They made it through a long winter. We're into March, and we're not out of winter yet, right? And so we got the month of April. April up here can be a doozy, so you never know what you're going to get. Checking your feed at this time of the year is crucial because it's typically, in my experience, is when your biggest populations are on the verge of starving. Now, with the Russians, I don't really see that. They do really well at building their nests in the fall. They store more honey around the brood chambers. And, I honestly don't do a lot of feeding. I just don't. And I'll kind of get into that later on here. So this is winter cluster size of the Russian honeybee. And these are just some examples of what I normally see out in my yards. The cluster on the left there, let's see. Oop, I pressed the wrong button. I'll get back into her. All right, the cluster on the left there, that is a cookie cutter cluster that I see a lot of. And this is on a cooler morning. It's probably late morning, probably noonish time on a 25-degree day in March. And this is an ideal cluster that you want to see in March. You got honey all the way around the outside of the cluster. Chances are that cluster started down in the lower brood chamber in early winter, and it slowly migrated up into the top. And how that works is the bees will cluster on the last brood that they have in the colony. And with the Russians, on how they build up, in the fall, the moment I begin to feed the bees, they push those queens down. And the queen most generally ends up into the lower brood chamber, and that's where she'll end up with her final brood. And that's where the cluster will start. And that's ideal for overwintering because they got all the honey above them. They'll start eating that honey in the lower brood chamber, and they'll slowly work up into the top. And by March, if they're up there, that's perfect, because they got just a month and a half, 2 months of winter left. They got all the honey above them, and they're going to be set to go for spring. The cluster in the middle, this was from 2 weeks ago. So this was a new picture I took. That's what this hive would look like on a warmer day. So the cluster breaks. You can see they spread out across the hive, and those bees are moving in honey from the outside in because they've taken advantage of the warmer weather, right? So they're broke cluster, they're moving honey in, and they're gearing up for some extra colder weather. And they're really good at taking advantage of that kind of weather. And they're really good at moving honey in because they know they're going to need it. This is a cluster here. I run a lot of my bees on pallets, but I also run about 4 yards on individual bottom boards. I got the inner cover, I got the telescopic lids, probably a lot like what you guys have. I call it my old school yards because there's not a lot you can do when it comes to moving them other than actually lifting them up by hand. So I got 4 yards like that, and I will say they overwinter really well in those colonies. And I don't do anything special. You can see just a piece of 2-inch high-density styrofoam on top of the inner cover. I got a cardboard pack that goes over it that's got some wax on, and that's it. And I walk away. But this is some typical clusters that I see throughout my outfit here. Here's some of my overwintering yards.
Cardboard. Do you put the cardboard over the top of the hive too? Or
Yeah, so I fold it right over the high density styrofoam, and then I take the telescopic lid and I just place that over the top of the box to hold everything in. I don't twine things or ratchet strap anything down. I'd have a lot of string if I did, have to do that. But I use the weight of the telescopic lid to hold everything in place. You can see here, the telescopic lid, I basically fold the boxes shut, I put the lid on top, and that holds everything in. And I'm only using a 2-inch piece of high density styrofoam on the top of the inner cover. These are some pictures of my old school yards, I call it. And this picture here I wanted to highlight. If you guys can see, you can see the bee poop there in the snow. And this was on a March day, one of the last times we've actually had a winter. And this was in the middle of March, and before I even opened a lid on the colonies in that yard, I knew the yard was doing very well because you can see the even layer of bee poop. And that particular day was very still, there was no wind, and you could hear the bees actually humming. In that yard I got 38 colonies, and I think I only lost 3. And there was 28 colonies that were very, very big and beautiful. And so there was a lot of energy in that yard and a lot of power. And I just wanted to highlight that you can tell how your bees are doing without even opening a lid. Pay attention to the snow. If we don't have snow, if you see some dead bees drug out in front, that's a good sign. That means the bees are doing their house cleaning. All those are awesome signs that you don't have to necessarily peek into your hives. Right here, this was a good one. That was 2019. That was when we had the polar vortex. I don't know if you guys remember that or not, but there's a little town by me, and that was 40 below zero 2 nights in a row. And we had 2 weeks of single-digit temps and below zero temps, and me and Manly thought every bee was dead, because it was a long haul, and it was at the wrong time of the year. And so the snow got to be so deep, we actually had to invest in a ranger with tracks because it was the only way that we could get in to check the bees. A lot of my yards are a half-mile off the road. They're on the edges of bluffs. They're really hard to get to. And so if the truck can't get in, I tried snowshoes and a toboggan, and that was getting old. And so we decided to get this Ranger. It was going to be good to use on the farm, anyway. So that year we figured we paid the Ranger off just by keeping the bees fed because it was just a long, hard winter. And even though they were Russians, they still needed the help because it was that long a winter. So keep that in mind. Just because these bees are Russians and they're cold hardy, you still have to take care of them. Beekeeping is beekeeping, and that's part of it. But that really paid off. I just remember I was so happy when we got that because I was tired of hauling packs of feed in by hand. All right, so we made it through winter, and we got the packs off. Bees are coming up. The moment these Russian bees start to collect pollen is when you really see some awesome things. These Russians, like right now, being in the middle of February, they don't have much for brood. And maybe their brood is probably the cluster of a softball right now. And that's ideal because they're not using any extra honey going towards the brood. Back when me and my dad kept bees, when we had Italians, we would notice at this time of the year, if we weren't out checking them, they're on the verge of starvation, there'd be slabs of brood in there, about like that. And those queens begin to lay because the days are getting longer. And that's what makes Italians and Carnolians and that kind of stock a little extra tougher to make over winter because they're so focused on making brood. And so with the Russians, they really won't start brooding up until the pollen comes in. And that's usually in my area, it's around the 20th of March. Last year was a month early. Last year I had pollen on the 19th of February. And in all of Manly's years, 64 years of keeping bees, in my short time of doing it, we've never seen pollen that early ever. And so I really seen some neat things last year because of the winter we never had. And the bees really built up quick. They had a tendency to swarm quick. A lot of beekeepers complained about bees swarming. They were raising cells all year, and I really blame it on the fact that the bees built up so early, and it got really tough for the bees to get out of that. But these Russians, the moment that pollen comes in, the queen begins to lay. And so they're really good at conserving the feed in the colony as they build up. They won't allow themselves to build up to the point where they need to starve or they need, that extra help. They'll kind of grow into the weather, if that makes sense. So, if we get decent warm up, the pollen comes in, the bees begin to lay, and then all of a sudden it gets cold again, those queens will back right off. They'll chase the weather. And that's what makes it really nice because they're very diversified. Here's a frame of brood here. This is just a classic frame. You can see the honey in the corners, fresh pollen coming off the trees, right above the brood, some more honey there, and I pulled that right out of the middle of a hive. And I see a lot of that. I mean, each colony that's big and strong has that kind of pattern, that kind of build in the colony. And they're really good at storing that close by to the brood chamber. And this frame here is a frame of pollen. You can see some loose honey there that they just stored in on the edges. This is probably when dandelions first started to kick, I'm taking a guess at. And that's really, if you think about it, I was going to touch bases on that too. You know, these bees, when they go into winter, and the last time that we looked at them, we gave them feed probably in October, September, right? And when it comes to overwintering, they're not making any honey to take care of themselves until May. Unless you're in a good spot where you got some maple flow, some box elders or whatever. But in my area, you know, it takes the dandelions to come on to really be like, all right, these things can start taking care of themselves a little bit better. You know, so it's a long haul that these bees have to go through to get to the point to where they need to take care of themselves. This time of the year, it's a good time to boost your wheat colonies. With anything with overwintering, that's all I do, that's all I've ever known. You're going to have a little bit of this. You're going to have big colonies, you're going to have wheat colonies. And those wheat colonies, if they hold on through April, April's a tough month for the weaker hives. And if you can get them to hold on through April, this time of the year, which is about the end of April, the first part of May is a good time to start to boost your weaker colonies. And with the Russians, I honestly don't spend much time with the weaker ones. I usually give them a frame of brood that looks about like that. Ideally, you'd want it merging a little more, you know, mature bees that are hatching, so you don't got to worry about the brood getting chilled or anything like that. And then give it a couple shakes and nurse bees on top of it, just to ensure that that brood isn't going to chill. And that's it. I walk away. I don't do much with my small clusters. They usually come on, they build up on their own, and then they're going to be ready to make me some honey. And that's how I kind of do that with my smaller clusters. Selecting colonies for splitting. So this is about the 1st of May when I start doing that. And back in March here, I start paying attention, you know, I'm out checking bees in March, I start paying attention to what size of clusters I have. And then I write that down, I get a good idea, like Pete 2 yards got, you know, 20 big hives. Hesper, Iowa yards got 10 big hives. And I take a note of that. And that way I know back at the warehouse how much equipment I got to get around, because I want to try to split all my big hives. It helps control swarming. It's a way for me to make up my numbers. It's a way for me to make nukes for people that want to buy them. And so I want to round up all my numbers, and I'm shooting for like 250, 300 bigger clusters, bigger colonies that I will split from. And so how I split is I go out and I add a 3rd deep brood chamber to each one of my big hives. And with the Russians, what's really unique, and this is kind of counterintuitive to basic beekeeping, but most beekeepers would put that 3rd deep on the top of the hive. And they would figure the bees would migrate up into the top deep, and the queen would get established, and you'd have 3 deeps of bees. Well, with the Russians, what we found over the years is they would rather push the queen down and store all the extra honey that comes in up in that extra box. And what you're left with is a honey-bound hive. You don't have any brood to split from, and they've pushed her down to the bottom board. So what we found was, and it's a lot of extra work, but I actually take the 2 hives, or the 2 deeps I have off of my pallet or my bottom board, and I put my empty brood chamber down on the bottom board. And then I put the 2 boxes back on top, and what that does is these Russians are so good at growing down. And so they're so focused on the honey when it comes in that they won't allow her to have a place to lay. A lot of other breeds of bees will always allow her to brood and to be active in the brood nest, but with the Russians, they're so focused on the nutrition and the pollen and the honey that they actually drive her down and put all the honey up. And so by doing what I'm doing, I'm keeping the established brood right up top here. And you can see here, these deeps I just put down there. It was probably a couple of weeks before I come back to took this picture, and you can see the established nest is in the top 2 deeps, and they're a double deep of bees, so these are big bees. And so I add my empty deep on the bottom, and the idea is that she will keep that established brood nest that she's already established through spring up top. And then when I come back to split, I take my queen excluders, I shake the bees down out of the top deep, I check for brood, I check for the health of the brood. If I got any chalk brood, I'll just mark the colony, I won't split out of it. If I got any kind of European fowl brood, I'll mark the colony, I'll come back and treat it. This is also a time that I look to see if the queens need to be requeened. It's a great time of the year to just go through your colonies and see what needs to be done. And at the same time, I'm checking for the queen, I'm getting the brood where I want it. If it's a big colony, I'm looking to get about 2.5 to 3 nucs out of it. And I'm basically splitting one whole box away, and I'm leaving them back into a double deep. And so it's a great deal because you're left with a double deep of bees and they're ready for the honey flow, and you just split 2.5 to 3 nucs off of them. So it's a win-win. And it controls the swarming because you were taking the brood away. And you know, the timing for us up here in North Iowa, it kind of works out that way. Now this might not work for a lot of people depending on your location or anything, but by the time they're split, this is usually at the heart of the dandelion flow. And so they're kind of wanting to swarm, they're kind of wanting to get the cells going, and I knock them out of that attitude right away. And they basically have about a 2-3 week window to build back up, and then the honey flow is coming the end of June, the 1st of July, and we're into it. And so this is a great way for me to manage my big colonies. This might not work for everybody, but this is how I do it. And it's quick because I got the queens down. I don't have to worry about looking for the queen. I went through and I actually shook each frame, right? And the queen's down under the queen excluder. She's down into the lower 2 brood chambers, and I got all the brood and honey and pollen I need to make my splits. And then when I come through with my crew, we just get the empty nucs and we load them up. We just bang, bang, bang. I'm the guy making the splits. I put brood, I put bees and everything in there. And that's how I make my splits. Yeah, go ahead.
So you put the bottom
empty deep.
on the bottom.
Yes, yep.
And then how long then after that?
3.5 weeks, three weeks. So I usually put my empty deeps on the 1st of May. And what's really funny in our area is a lot of years I'm pulling packs at the end of April, depending on our weather. And so there's a lot of years I'm pulling packs and then I'm grafting 2 weeks later. So it's really quick how these bees come on. And typically the weather kind of follows suit to that. It just depends on the year. But that brood chamber goes on May 1st. I've done that for 10 years now. And by the end of May, they're ready to split. And most typically, they've built up into 3 deeps. And so you've got a lot of power there. You've got a lot of bees there, and you've got a lot of brood there.
That upper, so she did continue to lay it.
Yes, because, and it all depends on the honey. Yeah, so like if they started really getting into honey, and they start to bring that in, usually with the dandelion, then I really got to watch that. And they could push her out of that top deep, and I don't want that because I want her to have established brood up there for me to pull out of. And so if that's the case, I'll go out and I'll put honey supers on early. And any extra honey they'll push up, and that'll keep her up in these 2 deeps laying. And the goal is by the time that I come back to split, a lot of that brood had hatched out of here. She's got nice larvae up there. There's different stages of everything. But that's going to be a surge of bees to go down into that empty deep that I just put on them. And it just contains them from swarming. You're adding that extra room, right? And then for me to pull that deep off to split, it just makes it easy. Pushing queens down, great time to requeen. All right, so selecting my breeder hives and grafting. So this is the time of year I get into doing that. And for my breeder hives, I usually have about 10 of them. And I narrow that down from about 100. And I put my potential breeder hives, they are bees that I make up in June of last year, so June of 2024. And then they go into fall without any treatment. I don't treat them. They're in test yards. They go into winter. I do washes in the fall to see where their levels are at. And even if I'm at, let's say there's 8 mites per 300 bees, I leave them be. I don't treat them or anything. They'll go into winter. I'll see how they overwinter. I'll see how their mite levels are come spring. And what's really neat about the Russians is 9 times out of 10, I'll have colonies marked that had 8 mites in the fall and say October, and then that colony lived, and then I'll do a wash in the spring and it's down to 0. Well, what took place there, because I sure didn't go out there with my oxalic acid vaporizer and do any treating in the wintertime, And so with this Russian bee, they're really good at grooming. And during the winter months, they're basically 100% broodless. And so you got a lot of heroic mites that are in there, if there is any, crawling around. They don't have anywhere to hide. And so these Russians are good at grooming themselves, and they actually chew the mites off. That's what I honestly think that happens, because come spring, when I wash those colonies, it's just really neat to say, well, this one went down. It was higher in the fall. Now here they are coming out of winter cleaner, you know. And so it's really neat, because these colonies, once again, are untreated. And so once they get through winter, I go through and I check for mite resistance. And when I wash my colonies, I want to have everything at zeros. Those are my breeder hives. Those are the genetics that people get from me. Those are the genetics that I keep for myself. And then I check for how they overwinter, which is a bonus for people that want to overwinter. I know there's a lot of skepticism on bees, say, produced down in California or Texas. They bring them up here in Iowa. They're supposed to overwinter just as good. But I tell you, it's not the case. We've been doing it long enough that I know that the stuff I raised, the stuff me and my dad raised off of survivor stock, more or less, does way better than what you can get from Texas or California. Even though a bee's a bee, and they're going to do what they have to do to live during the wintertime, you see noticeable changes. Maybe the cluster's small from those bees that come up from down south versus the clusters I have up here are nice and big. So there's some changes there, but that's a whole other topic. So then I test them on the honey production. Now keep in mind, my breeder hives never went through a full year of collecting honey. They were started as June nucs, and the only honey they were able to produce was in the fall. So I keep track of what hives produced what in the fall, and then I take that into how well they built up in the spring on the spring flow. And then the temperament. Now everybody, when they hear Russian bees, they probably heard that they're ugly or they're ornery. And so that's been around for years, and me and Manley and everybody else have heard about it. And studies have shown, now this just come out at our annual Russian Bee Breeders meeting that we have, and studies have come out now and said that Russian bees are exactly in the middle of Italian and Carnolian stock. They're right in the middle. And the only time they get aggressive is when they're on a pollen dearth. And that makes them more defensive over the brood in the colony. And that's something I notice because it's usually around 2 times in the year that I notice my bees get a little grumpy, and that's springtime and fall time. And it's always in correlation with a lack of pollen. Now, if they got pollen coming in the colony and they're doing their thing, they're perfectly fine. I worked bees back when my dad and I were together, and we had Italians, we had Carnolians, we had buckfast. Buckfast queens, they're very ugly. Me and my dad, we tried that, and it didn't go very well. And so when I work the Russians, I honestly don't see any difference. And I tell people, you know, I've got roughly 680 colonies, and I can count on one hand how many really, truly aggressive hives that I come across every year. And it's just not the case. I think what people run into is when you get into like the F2 generation, they call it. And so say the Russians would happen to supersede, and then they would breed with your neighbor's bees, and you get a cross of genetics. And I think that's when people have some bad experiences, because that can happen, but that can happen with any bee. It doesn't matter if you got Italian or Carnies or whatever. Once that queen decides to supersede, or that hive does, and she goes to open mate, you're not going to really know what you're going to get back, and that opens the room for a colony to be ugly. So that's all I'm going to talk about, the temperament, because it's something we've always dealt with, and they're just not very ugly. So queen ring, this time of the year, I got my breeders selected. It's time for me to graft. I do all the grafting. I bought a book, I read it, and I taught myself how to graft. I never took any course or anything. I just trial and error, figured out what worked. I won't dive too much into queen rearing because that's a whole other topic on its own. But I get my cell builders ready. Those take some pretty big hives. I do everything out behind the honey house. I move in a lot of bees because that's one of my mating yards. And so I got everything I need close by. Here's me grafting there. My grafting room is just an old tool shed that's got a heater in it, and that's it. You don't need anything crazy. I got a humidifier in there, keeping it pretty humid. I crank the heat up to about 80 degrees. I got a card table there that I've used for years, and I bought a chair from Walmart. and that's all I use. I don't have anything crazy fancy. I graft over 1,000 queens a year right in that very room. You can see there the picture in the middle. It's pretty tough to see, but there's a perfectly grafted aged larvae right in the middle of that cup. I'm a fan of the push-in cups from JZBZ. They're kind of the older school ones. They're smaller. They're easier to get on the comb. That's just what I like to do. I don't do anything with timing boards or anything like that. I've trained myself to kind of go in my breeders. I'll find frames that have different aged larvae in it, and I know what I need to graft from, that 12 to 24 hour old stuff. Picture here is usually what it looks like when I pull a frame out. This is like on day 10 or 11, so these are coming out to get put into nucs, so they're ready to hatch. I typically have 80 to 95% take on most of my grafting I do. That's kind of just an overrun. I think I got some more pictures. Yeah, so here's some more pictures of, I do a lot of my queens. I raise them out of mini mating nucs. You can see the picture there. I just caught a queen out of there. That's a queen there that's getting ready to get mailed out. I just basically catch the queen. I put in a new cell. I time that all out on a calendar basis. I know how many days it takes for her to get established. You can see this one was a little behind because the brood's starting to hatch. I don't like to let them get that big because these little mini mating nucs will swarm on you. And you'll have little swarms hanging around.
Pull the queen out, sell her, and put another queen cell.
Immediately after. I don't have to worry about them chewing them down or anything. They're not really big enough to be that temperamental. And so by catching a queen, I can come back and I'll time it to where I catch the queen, and then I got a graft coming off where I can just go back in there with a cell. Yep. And here's what I carry my cells around with. This is just an old cigar box. Nothing crazy fancy. I cut them out of my frames like what you saw up here. I just take a knife and I take the bars out. I lay a towel on the back of my truck and I just cut the cells. At this time, they're like on day 11, they're pretty durable. Some of the older queen breeders I talked to, the old timers used to say that they used to have a 5-gallon pail and they'd have it in between their legs and they'd actually cut the cells out with their knife and you can hear it tick, tick, tick down in that pail. And they were all right with that. So these queens are actually very tough at this stage. But this is how I transport them in the yard. I go to yard and I basically just make up a nuc and I put my frames in that have the cells like that, and that's how I travel to each mating yard. But once I get to my mating yard, I cut the cells, I put them in this little box here. Then usually I have my wife, she's out there helping me, she's handing me the cells as I'm putting them in the nucs or however, because there's a lot going on. You know, you got your hive tool in one hand, smoker here, and you almost need a third arm to be putting in queens. So this is just kind of an overrun of me catching queens and putting a queen cell back into my mating nucs. Mating yards. So this is an important deal for me because to be a part of this Russian thing, you have to make sure you have Russian drone saturation. And this is something we really take a lot of time to overlook into. And I move in a lot of bees. Like if I mate 100 nucs in one area, I've got probably 80 colonies that I move in. And every year on my mating yards, they've been established for years now. We go around the neighborhood, we talk with other beekeepers, we make sure these areas are isolated. Because with queens, they open mate, right? And you're not going to be in control of a lot of what they can do to mate. But if you're in control of oversaturating your area with the Russian drones, you're almost guaranteed that they're going to mate with the Russian drones that you want. And there's been times, I even had a hobbyist beekeeper, he wanted a couple hives, I gave him a couple free nucs and some queens. As I said, I'd rather have you keep the Russians than you bring in, you know, some other bees. And so we do that. I do that every year. I got 5 main mating yards that I mate in. They're really good. They got south-facing draws. They're kind of an open meadow. Just had some awesome landowners that we worked out a deal with. It works out good. I can move in a lot of bees in there. That's one of the biggest things. Now, drone stock from other members. So I get queens every year from the other members of the RHBA. And by doing that, we get genetic diversity in our stock. So I'm getting their genetics. I get queens, I establish them in colonies, I put them in my mating yards. And years of doing this, you're diversifying your genetics. And this has been, this has been going on since the early 2000s and 90s, but you still hear it today as being an important factor of a bee's survival is genetic diversity. diversity. And I honestly think that's a big reason why these Russian bees are why they are. Because they're so adaptive, that they got that genetic diversity that we try so hard to get them to be in for the mating yards and what they mate with. But this is a very important deal. I work very hard every year to maintain that and to get enough bees in, in the area that I mate in. So then we dive into honey production. So this gets even more kind of interesting. The Russians will forage earlier and later in the day. It's been proven, and I've even seen it with my own eyes. Down at the honey house, there's a lot of mornings I'm getting down there. It's right at daybreak. Sun hasn't come up yet. Things are just getting blue. The robins are barely chirping. And I've got a European linden tree on one end of the building. I got some Russian sage on the other end. And the bees are actually bouncing on the bloom. And it's blue out. It's early. And they're out there waiting for things to warm up and waiting for the nectar to come out. And it's really neat because, and maybe not a lot of people pay attention like that, but that is for sure something I've actually noticed. Their ability to adapt to different conditions. Last year was a perfect example of that. That would have been last year. We had an early spring. We never had a winter. We went into June and it got really wet. It rained every third day in my area last June. And just as the bees were getting ready to go out to forage, it rained. And it'd rain again, it'd rain again. And what I noticed last year at this time is the queens actually shut down laying completely. And it was kind of alarming because I thought, whoa, what's going on here? And it was because they weren't getting the pollen in. And I had 4 yards to the west of my outfit that is it's got more agriculture around it. It doesn't have the diversified landscape. And they weren't bringing any honey in for 28 days. And I was almost on the verge to feed them. And I come out, I just kept peeking at them. And the queen was all the way down. She laid up to 1 frame, but the population was huge yet. So what I found was the bees were actually, as the pollen decreased, she decreased, but she had so much brood in there, they had so much pollen that they stored from the spring that they were utilizing it. And so they maintained their population through that time, but yet they gave themselves a brood break, and that is a huge deal against mites, right? You got a brood break in June, and that's a huge deal, and that's naturally built in them. Versus other stock, I know it, they'll just continue to brood. They'll brood up, and they're going to use all the honey they have in the colony. They're going to use all the pollen they have because they're focused on brood. And so that's something I really noticed. And believe it or not, in those 3 or 4 yards, when I did my mite washes last fall, I had counts down to 3 or 4, and they weren't treated up until the end of September. And I'm like, whoa, that's kind of cool, right? And I really contribute that to the dearth we had in June. And those yards actually, those queens begin to slow down on the brood production. Resource efficient, producing brood at times in dearth. Russians are prolific. They can produce a lot of honey in the spring through fall and meet or exceed industry standards for honey production. Keep in mind when I told you in the springtime when I'm getting ready to split colonies and I go to put that empty on top, when that honey comes in, they roar it up and they'll plug that queen out. And it's the same way all year long. And so they really focused on honey yield. When the flowers and the trees are producing, they really get at it and they get at it quick. And the old saying is they can do more with less. And the honey production with these things are just absolutely outstanding. Being a beekeeper and being that I do it for a living, you got to have a bee that makes honey. And you got to have a bee that lives. And you got to have all these things you need. And it doesn't matter if I do it for a living or hobbyist or whatever, you got to have a bee that's going to give you the best experience. And honey is definitely up there. So these are some hives that were in some of my production yards. The picture there on the left is from the year before last. And these colonies are right next to, I got 30 other colonies in there. So there's competition. And most of my other hives in this yard here had 4 to 5 supers of honey on them, but these were the ones that stood out. And I couldn't get on top to put another box. But these were all full capped honey all the way down. These lower ones maybe had a little bit of brood in them. I don't run queen excluders because it's just a headache for me. But these ones here had a little brood, but most generally this was all just solid capped honey. This picture here is from last year. And this yard, once again, it was a full production yard, so there's a lot of competition there. These hives were up in the front there, and they stored a lot of honey. These deeps I put on last thing, I ran out of extracting supers last year, and I had about 100 of these extracting deeps left, and I went out, and I think they had those filled and capped in about 2.5 weeks. And the flow really came on, the bees really pushed up, and these 3 hives I checked 2 weeks ago, and they're all beautiful. And so typically, you know, like you hear the beekeepers talk, their best honey producing colonies are usually the first ones to crash in the fall. That's because they built up a high enough mite load because they had all the bees. Well, with the Russians, even though these 3 were very big, I mean, the big populations from the bottom board all the way to the top was just gobs of bees. And for them not to build up a mite load throughout the summer is really impressive. And like I said, I just checked these 3 colonies 2 weeks ago, and they're doing really well. Here's some more honey production yards. These are on my palletized yards. It's just, this is from last year here. Last year was a good year, even though we had a lot of rain in June. There's a super I break. So I break all my supers. It's something that Manly taught me, and it's a lot of work. So I actually take a hive tool, and I'll go through each box, and I'll break that one apart, that one apart, that one apart, and that one apart, all the way down to the brood chambers. And what I'm doing is I'm cleaning up the drip. The worst thing was when you're pulling honey and you're carrying your box to your truck and your jeans or your bee veil has got honey dripping down to your toes. And it can be a big mess. And so it's a lot of work, but before I pull a yard of honey, I'll go through and I'll break each box so the bees can clean the burr up. And for me, the amount of bees I run in the yard, I can't risk the chance of having them start robbing either. So you got all that honey dripping on you, and it gets to be that time of year where there's no honey coming into the colonies. Boy, they can get going. They can get going real bad. And they'll start robbing your jeans, they'll start robbing the truck. Anywhere where there's a honey that was on the deck of the truck or whatever, they're going to rob it. So by doing this, everything's nice and clean. The honey's all nice and dry. The burr isn't there. It's just what we do.
How long do you leave it when you break it?
About a day.
About a day.
Yeah, so a day ahead of time I break it. By the next day it's completely cleaned up and dry. Yep. Takes 2 hive tools. You got to jam, one in, and then you take your other one in, you kind of pry up, and then as they get lower, you kind of got to lean into the hive just a little bit, but it's more or less getting enough leverage. So this is honey harvest. So I run everything on drip trays. I put all my honey on drip trays. They look like that right there. That just contains the drip. I stack them up 6 high. I got a flatbed truck with a Tommy gate lift right there. That's the handiest thing in the world. And a lot of my yards are tough to get into, so I don't put my honey on pallets and load them up, with a bobcat or anything. I just can't get into my yards. Like I said, they're on old, logging trails off the beaten path, and it just isn't going to work. So how I pull honey is I got this Tommy gate. I lower it down about, yay high. I put my drip trays and I just start to stack up. I get them up, I got a hand cart there, and I basically hook onto the pallets and I load them up to the headboard, and here you can see this is off of 2 yards. I don't know how many boxes that is, but the truck was bottomed out. I had to go home real slow. I couldn't go very fast. Let's just put it that way. These yards were close by, and I figured I might as well pull them off all in 3 hours, and I did. And so that was a big load. Here you can see the hot room over here. My hot room is where I bring in my honey in the fall. Keeps everything nice and warm. This holds about 900 supers. I keep the temperature about 80 degrees in there, and it just makes extracting a lot easier. We get into extracting here. I don't have many pictures of my extracting room, but I had a few. Here's my chain uncapper. I got a Dakota Gunnis chain uncapper. I got 2 60 frame data ant radial extractors. I can do 120 frames at one time. I got a heat exchanger over there along the wall, and then I got a Cook and Beals spin float back in there. That takes all the wax out of the honey. And then all the honey is basically, it's kind of automated. So it gets pumped through, gets cleaned, and then ends up into the tank there in the back. And there's my wife there. She's been helping me in the honey house quite a bit. This is a frame of honey that was brand new. The bees drew it out. New wax, new honey, so it's always fun to see that come into the honey house. And then here's me pulling a barrel of honey out of the holding tank there. Here's my barrel inventory. So this is where I put my barrels I get off the bees. I stack them 3 high just to save on room. Here's where my empty supers go. So this is getting towards the end of the year, and so I'm starting to put them back away on storage. And here's my wax. I get a pretty good amount of wax. That all depends on the year, but I try to melt my wax and render it as I'm extracting. It just keeps everything clean and you stay ahead of it. Otherwise, I'd have a bunch of wax to do all at once, and melting wax is not very fun. And so now we're in, we got the colonies and everything, the honey's off. We're getting into preparing the colonies for winter. And the biggest thing is, go ahead.
So when do you pull honey?
I start the end of July, typically. And it depends on a lot of things. You know, if it's a slow year, I won't start till maybe August. If it's a good year and I'm running out of supers, I'm going to have to pull and extract and get them back out. So it all depends. But usually July and August is usually when I start. So anyways, the honey's off. Get into getting the colonies prepared for winter. Obviously fall feeding, what style of feeder works best for you guys. I'll tell you what I do. Adding antibiotics to your feed, Fumidil B. I'm a fan of using that. It's preventative for nosema. It's very expensive stuff, but it's the only thing out there that prevents nosema. I add it to my feed every year just for a precautionary thing. Nosema is not very fun to play with if you've ever dealt with it. You know, all the poopy frames and everything else. It's a very common killer of bees. Then treating for varroa mites, and then supplemental pollen to boost your winter nest. Now, I talked with Andy Joseph, he's our state inspector last year, and it sounded like a lot of Iowa was having issues with this. Their bees weren't brooding up in the fall when they needed to. And that's all based on the amount of pollen they're getting into the colonies. If you were in an area that didn't have a good pollen flow last fall, you had these great big populations, but now 2 weeks ago, you went out to check them and they're little tiny clusters, chances are that those bees they didn't lay enough young bees to go into winter. And so always keep in mind, if you have to feed pollen in the fall, do it. I mean, guys in Canada, the moment that canola is done with, that's all the bees have, and they have to supplemental feed the moment the flow stops. And they go through a lot of winter. And so I'm a fan, if you have to pollen or use pollen supplement to get your bees boosted up in the fall, go ahead and do it. Because you want that nest to be as young and many as young nurse bees as you can, because that pays off on your cluster size come March.
The fact that even if you put pollen on, if
Yeah.
they need it, they'll take it. If they don't,
If they don't, they won't, because you'll know. I mean, they're going to choose the real deal over the pollen substitute anyway. But that's exactly right. Put it on. If they need it, they'll use it. You know, if not, they won't. But it's such a crucial deer. You know, and I think last year a lot of beekeepers, you know, I talked to a lot of them, and they're like, man, my bees are starting to shrink. They're going backwards. And this was in October when you should have your biggest populations going into winter. So nutrition, you know, and that's with any bee, but nutrition is number one to getting your bees to go through winter, and then you got your mites too. But those two things, between controlling your varroa and your nutrition, that's going to give you the best luck to go through winter with getting bees out in the spring. I'll touch basis on treating. So my treating program is I don't do any treating in the spring. My bees come through winter most generally low enough where I don't have to do any formic, I don't have to do any oxalic acid treating. They just go all the way till fall, and then I pull the honey and I treat. And I use formic acid, I use Apiary, that's Amatraz. I've used both of those in years past, and then I usually follow up with an OA vapor treatment when they get broodless. The Russians are really good. Usually by about the 15th of October, they're really down to just a little patch of brood. If the weather's right, these last falls we've been warm, and the brood things continued to stay present, and that's all not so good. I mean, you got to figure the later you got brood in the year, the more room those mites have to hide. And so, you know, treating later in the year with the oxalic acid vapor is great. You know, wait till Thanksgiving. I mean, depending on if your bees are packed or not. But waiting until they're completely broodless with that is the best. And so that's all I do. I get the honey off, I treat them, I go 1 or 2 rounds with the OA vapor, and that's it. There's a lot of guys I know that are commercial. They'll treat 8 times a year. And they start in the spring, and they treat through the summer, and they go through in the fall. And that's when they have their best bees. And so there's a defined difference. Now, I overwinter my bees, so my bees aren't exposed to a lot of other people's bees. I think that has a lot to do with it. A lot of guys migrate, they go to the almonds to California, they go down to Texas or wherever, they take their bees down there, and you've got every neighbor down there with bees that are just, you're gonna, you know, bees are like a sponge. That's what I tell people. If that person's got problems, you've got problems. It's just how beekeeping works. So I think between, you know, the bee I have and being that I overwinter and I got my yards kind of away from other beekeepers, that all contributes to not having to fight Varroa as much. Anything else? I'll get into fall feeding. So this is how I feed. I typically want to be wrapped up with feeding by the 15th of October. If I can get started earlier, I will. It just depends on the year. At this time, my treating's all done. Everything's treated. If you wait till October to treat your bees, most generally, you're going to have issues. The best way with any bee is to get your treatments on the moment you pull your honey off. The quicker it's on there, the better it is. But this is me getting ready to feed. This picture here in the middle, I got my tanker load. That holds a tanker load of syrup. And I just gravity flow it out onto my truck. I got a feed truck with a tote on it. I got a pump on it. And I got enough room up by the headboard to hold about 90 pails. And I'll usually do 3 yards. That's just about enough for 3 yards of bees. I got some yards that are a 45-minute drive away. So I want to be able to get out and attack those yards that are farther away. So I want to get the most bang for my buck on the road time. So I got my truck all organized the best I can just to get those bigger trips out of the way. I got feeder lids there. You can see on the truck, that's what they kind of look like. My pails are there. They're nothing fancy. It's a 3.5 gallon pail. It's made from Letica. That's the company that makes them. It's got a screw cap on it, so it's got kind of a bung hole. I can put my syrup in it, screw the cap back on, and I've got 4 holes drilled right in the middle of the lid, and that's it. By doing it this way, you can give the bees enough syrup if they need it. So my pails go to 3.5 gallons. That's roughly 40-something pounds of feed. Now, when I go to feed bees in the fall, and I'm sure most of you heard this, how do you know how much to feed a hive? That's a very common question. And I lift every one of my hives by hand. I lift every one. And I'll mark them in the corners of the lids on how many gallons I'll feed that exact hive. So for example, on this pallet, maybe this colony needs a full pail, 3.5. This colony needs 1.5 gallons. That colony over there maybe needs 2. And so each colony, bees are like people. You're going to have some bees that eat more, some bees that won't eat hardly any honey at all. So when it comes time to feeding them in the fall, especially for the price and the cost of what it costs to feed them, by doing it this way, I found that you can feed that colony exactly what it needs, but yet you're not overfeeding and wasting a bunch of feed. Because you can feed too much, in the fall, and then come spring, they're completely honey-bound, and they don't have any room to expand. And that's a big problem. People figure, I'll just pour the wood to them, I'll get them so heavy they can go through winter for a whole year. Well, if you have that kind of mindset, the queens won't have room to expand. So it's kind of a trick to figure out whether or not, just the right amount of feed, but not too much. And I just, it's tough to explain it, but I just reach down to the bottom of the hive, I lift it off the pallet, and you get a good feel on what that colony needs, because overdoing it enough, you know what the weight of the wood weighs, the bees, the frames, all that stuff obviously has weight to it. But the way I best describe it, a colony is perfect when they're rock heavy, if that makes any sense. So if you reach down and you lift the back of your colony and you can just get it up off your bottom board or your pallet, they're perfect, and you can just walk away. And that works for Russians. Now, when my dad and I kept Italians, we figured it took about 120 pounds of feed to get them through winter. And that's no joke. And that was the only way that we could get those bees where we didn't have to worry about them starving. And that's a lot of feed. If I had to feed that amount to the hives I have now, I'd go broke. So that's how I judge the colonies. I've got a scale I carry, so then I know exactly how many gallons to pump into my pails. I put that on my Tommy gate. I use it as a table. I got a scale. It's more or less a hose with kind of a gas nozzle on the end of it. That's what I use to pump. And like I said, I'll go to each hive. I'll mark them. I'll write them in my book. And then when I go to fill pails, I'll have a stack behind me that's got 1 gallon, 2 gallons, and 3.5. And I individually feed hives that way, and it's worked very, very, very well.
You don't put nothing around your pails when you put them on, you just put them on top of the hive?
Yep, so you can see there I got the feeder lid, and there's a 2-inch hole cut out right in the middle of that, and that's just a 1/4-inch piece of plywood. Nothing fancy or thing like that, and you can see the rings kind of where the pails have been over all of the years of doing it, and you tip the pail over, and the pail will create a vacuum, and there'll be a little syrup run, and then all of a sudden the vacuum kind of goes into the pail, and then it starts to drip, and then the bees will pull it out. So you don't have hardly any waste. For overwintering, it works well because you can really put the feed on them. I mean, like I said, 3.5 gallons of syrup is like 46 pounds, and that's a lot of syrup. And most generally, that's, if I have to feed a light colony, that's what it takes for them to get to where they need to be. And so having that size of pail, it kind of covers you. A lot of people probably use frame feeders. That works too. The tough thing about frame feeders is it's so far away from the cluster if it gets cold. If you get late on getting your bees fed, the bees can't move over to get it. So having that feed right on top of the cluster is just a win-win. Plus, it's a way for me to get over all my hives. It's just a quick, efficient way to feed. Wrapping the bees for winter.
So I didn't understand.
Go ahead.
So,
Yep.
So the question I think was, so your feeder just sits on the top there?
Yep, so
without any box around it?
No, and so the syrup, how I have the pails and the holes, that syrup drips right down that hole.
Right.
Yep.
So the thing won't blow or?
Yeah, right. The weight of the pail keeps that down. And the bees will come up and they'll actually propolize the pail on there. I've got yards that are pretty exposed, and in my mind, well, I got to get back and get these pails because they're empty. We get a big old wind and it blows the pails off. I never have it. Those bees glue those pails down rather good, so I don't got to worry about the wind or anything taking them away.
Never any issues with raccoons or skunks?
Nope, never. Skunks will. So if it leaks out in front of the hive more than what you'd like, there'd be skunks and possums. They'll start to dig, but it's very infinitesimal. I don't see it a lot. And if I do, the bees are usually, like I said, like these colonies here. If they got a skunk out in front, they're going to take care of them. They'll start to sting them and get them out of there. Skunks can be a problem. I mean, trust me, skunks are designed, and I think I have this right. They'll go up to a hive and they'll beat on it, and they'll turn their butt to it, and they'll wave their tail, and the bees will get stuck in their tail, and they'll walk off, and they'll eat the bees. That's how they attack your hives. So they can be a problem. I mean, there's times I got to set traps. I've put bait out. You got to be real careful with that. But skunks can be a real problem in the bee yard. Possums, not so much. Coon can be. I've had some big coon take the lids off a hive or two, but it's pretty rare. But skunks can be kind of a problem. Most beekeepers usually run into that, and they got live cages and whatnot. But they can become kind of a pain in the butt.
You didn't cover bears.
Yeah, so bears. I'm in bear country. There's about every year I get a yard that gets not necessarily tore up. It has happened. But bears investigate my yards. There's getting to be more and more of them. I live in the driftless region of Iowa, and I'm right on the edge. I'm not too far from the river, so they migrate from the river. They get into the bluff country, and every year I get it. We had a yard, this is probably 5 years ago. This was over by Hesper, Iowa, and a bear got in there. I just pulled packs out of there. Bees were looking good in there. Bear come in, must have been right after I left. And I came back probably a week or two later, and he tore every hive apart. And we figured he scratched out 800, 900 pounds of honey and ate that. And the brood, they're really after the brood. They love the brood. And so you could see claw marks where he went through the brood. He scraped it right down to the plastic foundation. He pressed on the boxes and smashed them from the side walls in. It was, I think, out of the whole yard, there was 3 hives that made it. And that bear was an old bear. And I think it actually ended up getting shot or dispatched about 10 miles to the south of the yard. It ended up getting into a guy's yard. And the story goes, he had his 22, whatever, the bear was running after his dog. I don't know. But anyways, the bear's no longer there. A lot of people got kind of upset about that over there. Yeah, not me being the beekeeper, but yeah.
What kind of pails did you say you put on, or what's a?
Letica is the company that makes them. Letica. They're based out of Michigan, I believe. I bought them from a beekeeper in South Dakota. But that's what it says on the bottom. What's nice with those pails is they're ultraviolet resistant, so the sun won't break them down. They kind of got a rubber flex to them, kind of. They've been used for a lot of years. Yeah, I mean, that's just a great way to feed your bees. So getting the bees wrapped for winter. So I've got 2 styles of wrap. Like I said, I got some old school yards like you see here. This is just the generic overwinter pack. Data and Man Lake used to handle them. They don't anymore. There's a company, I think, out of Michigan that makes these yet. They're just real convenient. It's just cardboard, wax, dipped in paraffin. It's black. And in my opinion, when it comes to wrapping bees, people tend to wrap them too much or too tight. And in my opinion, then they got issues with moisture. And the way I explain it to people, so I'll start in here first. So you can see here on my pallet equipment, even on these hives, I got overwintering holes, one there, one there, one there, and one there. And I went through all my equipment 2 years ago and I drilled holes and everything to make sure I had them. And those holes serve a lot of different purposes. And it's just a hole, but it really makes a difference. Now, these holes, and this is old school beekeeping, the reason why these holes are there, for starters, is if the snow's deep and the bottom of the brood chambers get covered and the bees can't get out. Also, if the cluster starts down low in the lower brood chamber and we get a warm day and they want to go and take a cleansing flight, if your only entrance is all the way up top, and let's say if it's on the bottom, great, but there's a lot of people that'll screen that bottom off, or the bees will collect on the bottom board and plug your lower entrance. That's a problem to have. So by having these holes, it gives them options to get out to fly. And as the cluster moves up through the winter, well, guess what? There's another hole. And so, in my opinion, and these holes are used year-round. Bees love to orientate to them. The virgin queens, if you've got a super procedure, she'll orientate to these holes more than your lower entrance. It's just under a 3/4 inch hole. I forget the size of the bit, but it's just big enough the bees can get through, but a mouse won't get in. But these holes are just, and they also work as ventilation. You know, when you wrap a colony, I was out, I guess it was the first part of January, and I was peeking at some hives. It was a cold stretch of weather, and I got down on my knee and I started peeking at the colonies, and there was frost coming out of each of the overwintering holes. Well, that was a great deal. That's them getting rid of that moisture. And they were using these overwintering holes to do that. And a lot of people, you know, new equipment, they don't like to drill holes in it or whatever, but this I think plays a bigger role than a guy can think. It gives the bees more options to get out and fly, helps with the ventilation. It's an overall win-win. And so with these bees here to the left here, all I do, like I talked earlier, is a 2-inch piece of high-density styrofoam. I put that on top of just the inner cover. I slide these cardboard boxes over the hive. They've got holes cut out in front so they can get in and out. And I fold the flap shut and I put the lid on top, and that's it. And I walk away. Now these hives here, this is my palletized equipment. And this is a little bit different. So this yard here, this was a new yard I set up last year, and so I didn't know how they were going to overwinter, so I gave them some extra insulation. You can see on top I got 2 big squares of high-density styrofoam. I got a sheet of bubble wrap, and then I bought some colony quilt and put it on the sides of the hive. Now typically in most of my yards, I only use 1 piece of the high-density styrofoam, 1 of the bubble wrap, and then I slide. These are custom-made packs that we had made by Jester. He's the guy that makes the Jester nucs. We had him make these packs for us. They were made over in India and got shipped over to us quite a few years ago, but these are custom packs. It's just corrugated plastic cardboard, not cardboard, but corrugated plastic. It's the same material that the nuc boxes are made out of. So they withstand the sun, they block out the wind and the snow, and we had those cut and designed to slide over a 4-way pallet. And so I wrap the tops, the bubble wrap kind of just seals the edges in. I put the cardboard box or the corrugated box over the top. I got a piece of lath on top. You can see the tabs there are all up, but I'll put a piece of lath on top. I'll fold the sides in and I'll staple it shut, and that's it. And what that allows is it gives an air gap around your hives. Most generally, and this has been written, I think 85% of the colony's heat gets lost through the lid. So if you insulate the very top of your hive, you're doing most of the work just in that. Not a lot of heat gets robbed from the sides of the hive. You know, being that you want to overwinter bees, most of us probably have our bees in a protected area, protected from the northwest, south exposure. Those are all very important things to overwintering a hive. And there's a lot of people that don't wrap their bees at all. And I wrap everything. what I tell people that kind of fight you on that is it doesn't rescue your big populations, but when you wrap your bees, it rescues your smaller clusters. And those smaller clusters are the ones that are going to need that extra help. And like I told you, when it comes to overwintering, it's tough to have every colony be big and beautiful. And so you're going to have some smaller clusters in there. And so by wrapping them, you're just going to help that in the long run. You know, it's all about covering your bases. So yeah, that's kind of just a basic on how I wrap my bees. Nothing fancy. Entrance cleats, I'll talk that. That's important. I'm a fan of getting your entrance cleats in once the honey flow is done. Mice are a big problem. I deal with a lot of them. And if you allow them to get into your colonies, when the bees start to cluster up and they can't protect themselves, there's a lot of times I go out and if I didn't get my cleats in, there's a nest already made right underneath of the hive. And so getting your entrance cleats in right when the honey flow is wrapped up and done, get them in, that's going to keep the mice out. Because mice will kill a hive real easy. Every year I run through like this pink styrofoam here, I got to replace it about every 4 years. It's a lot of money I invest in the insulation, and the reason why is the mice will just absolutely tear it up. And I wish there was a better way to do it, but I just can't. I mean, this stuff here, I found that the blue stuff is a little bit better. I don't know why. Mice don't tend to chew into it as much. I don't know why, but that's what I've noticed. The pink stuff with the pink panther on it, the mice really love that stuff. They'll chew right through it. This bubble wrap here, most of you probably are aware of that stuff. That comes in rolls. Bees won't chew through it. I think it's got kind of an aluminum to it. They don't really bother that. Some of this stuff is probably 25 years old there. So.
Do the mice eat the bubble wrap?
Nope, they don't. They chew into it, but they don't do much. They can't do as much. Yep. But the pink stuff and the blue stuff, they can kind of get on. And then they'll make a nest right on top of your lid. And when they do that, they just disturb your cluster all winter long. And so if you can control your mice, then you're already ahead of the game too. Here's some other yards here. This was a yard I checked a couple weeks ago. I just wanted to show the pack there. I got one piece of insulation on that, and that's typically what I put on, and then you can get a better look at that cardboard box I got that slides over the paddle. But this was just a couple weeks ago, and the bees look great there. I lifted all these. They had plenty of honey. They were expanded. They broke cluster, and if they can hold on like that till the end of April, I'd be very happy. This yard here is an old yard we've had for years. This is an old rock quarry over by me, and this is from a few years ago, but those barrels in the back there, those are what I mate my mini mating nukes on. And so I keep those off the ground because the coons and the skunks will really bother them, so we use old honey barrels, and I'll put those little styrofoam boxes up on top there. It's close to the yard there, and that works as a good mating yard.
So you'll make the nuke in that yard, just put the mating nuke right there then?
Well, I actually, so the tough part about those little mini mating nukes is getting them stocked. And so it takes actually bulk bees to do it. So I'll actually go out with screens, like cages about like that, and I'll go to yards and shake nurse bees into those cages. And then I'll go bring those bees back to the shop, and then we stock each of those mating nukes with just a cup of bees. And we scoop them out, we rattle them out, scoop them in. I put the queen cell in, and then we close the lids on them. And then those queen cells, I got it timed to where that I put them in on like the 11th day, so then they're going to hatch relatively quick. Once that virgin hatches, all those young bees we just shook in there are going to stay in that box. And then we give them a little shot of syrup, and that's all we do. And that's how you get those stocked. But we stock them all at the farm, and then I load them on the truck, and then I bring them into these mating yards. And then we put these barrels out. We put 4 mating nukes to a barrel right on top, and that keeps, like I said, the critters out of them. And because they're up high, the queens have a better chance of orientating that way. We got colors on the nuke boxes and all that, and that works very well. So, and that's it. Here's kind of my business card. I supply Russian queens, nukes, and honey. Here's some of my contact information. I never brought really actually any business cards with me, but if you guys wanted to jot that down or whatever, you're more than welcome to. I hope you guys picked up some stuff on the Russian bees. I've kept them for since I was 19, and I'm 31 now. So I got my dad convinced about 7 years ago to get into Russians. Now all of his stuff is going to be Russians. He's been running Russians for about 7 years. It's just an amazing bee. I can't put it really any other way. For how I keep bees and for how I overwinter, I keep everything here in Iowa. I couldn't do it any other way. I mean, if I tried to get another type of bee in my outfit, it just isn't going to work. Manley's worked hard, like I said, being a part of the RHBA and getting this stuff over here. He was part of the testing that took place in Iowa. This would have been probably 1998, somewhere in there, 1995, right around in there. But the lab from the USDA Baton Rouge Bee Lab come up here for 2-3, I think it was a 4-year project, and they tested the Russians right here in Iowa. They brought up a lot of bees. Manley switched everything over to Russians. They tested them on how well they overwintered. They had scales in every yard to see how much honey they ate through the winter. They documented all that stuff. There's a book actually written about it. A good friend of mine, Stephen Coy, and Dr. Tom Rindier wrote this book. It was published 2 years ago. If you guys are interested into learning more about the logistics and the journey it took for these bees to get over here, it's available on Amazon. I think it's $35-40. I'm not sure what you paid for it.
I got it on my Kindle.
Kindle, I think it's like $8 on Kindle.
Like 9 or 10.
Yeah, so it's pretty cheap on that. So if you guys are interested into learning more about the Russians, because I can't do a good job at explaining because I wasn't around. You know, this has all been years ago, and I've been around a lot of the guys that are still part of that group. They're my dear friends, but that book explains it the best way. It's very detailed. It's written in a way that you can understand it. And it just gives an in-depth look on all the testing and the hard, work it took to get these bees here. And, it's been around forever, and not a lot of people really know about it. We're pretty poor at kind of advertising this, but, like I said, with all the members across the country, we all got them. There's 10 of us, and these bees thrive in each part of the country here. So they're a great bee. So is there any questions? Anybody got any questions or anything? I can go back to the presentation, certain parts or whatever.
Is this your full-time job?
This is my full-time job. That's all I do. People ask me what I do in the wintertime, and I bottle honey, build bee equipment. My dad, he taught me how to build all your own equipment. My dad always had a slogan. He wanted to make a company out of it, but it was going to be the Bauer Better Built Beehive. Never happened, but I still try to make all my own equipment, so that keeps me busy in the wintertime. And I love to do it. It gives you kind of a goal to chase, in your life, and it gives you the freedom to do your own thing. Beekeeping's fun. It's challenging. I think in the next 10 years, the industry is going to see a lot of changes. Honestly, in my opinion, most everybody here probably knows about all the losses that the industry is starting to experience now. I was just talking with Richard about it. There are 300,000 colonies short out into the almonds. So then it starts to become a food security issue. Bees are a very important thing to have for our food. And, hopefully they can figure out what's killing the bees. Because the last time we had a loss like this goes back to 2006. And that was when colony collapse disorder was first kind of found. So it's a bad deal. So there's guys out there that have good bees. There's guys out there that don't have any bees. And, right now we don't know a whole lot. Guys are talking it's nutritional thing. Guys are maybe talking chemicals. Don't really know what's going on. Being in Iowa, we're obviously subject to a lot of chemicals, a lot of fungicide spray. I see stuff every year. I'm sure you guys do too. There's really not a whole hell of a lot that we can do about it. Having a bee that wants to live in today's world is pretty tough, especially at the cost to try to replace them is at an all-time high. People are charging $200+ a nuke. People are charging $180 for a package bee. Shoot, just in my time, I remember they were under $100. Queens used to be $15. So queen prices, all this stuff is elevated. So, like I tell people, you owe it to yourself to try to overwinter your bees, especially if that's what you're going to do. And if you can have a good experience in doing that by trying out Russians or any other kind of bee you want to try, there's obviously tricks to it all. But these Russians will give you a good fighting chance. So.
Did you say how many hives you actually have?
Yeah, I'm about 680 colonies. Yep, and I overwinter them all.
All 680 with just you two?
Yeah, I got Amish that help me, so I'm thankfully I'm in an area with a lot of Amish. I can't get any kids to help me. They don't know anything about bees, you know, that's the tough part. I think we're in a time period, I was just talking with Manley about this, there's kind of a generational shift going on in the industry. And guys like Manley are getting out of it. Manley's 83. There's a lot of beekeepers that are third generation families and their kids maybe aren't really into it. And so these beekeepers like Pat Ennis, he's not getting any younger, you know. And so there's kind of a generational shift and there's not a lot of young people into it now. I only know a few guys that are my age that are doing it at the scale I'm at. Most of it's, you know, guys out in the Dakotas, you know, but that's what worries me is the future here because there's not a lot of us to begin with. And so, you know, when you do this for a living, it's a big gamble because a lot of it's out of your control, you know. You in the back, yep. What's that now?
You want to know if kids normally attend these meetings?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think you've been probably working on that,
Well,
getting some new kids in here.
We don't have a lot of youth that are in the area.
Sure, yeah.
I mean, I try to promote it, you know, on my vendor shows and
It's
stuff. And
it's not popular. Beekeeping is one of those things where you got to love it, and you know, it takes the opportunity for somebody to figure that out. And without, you know, like if it wasn't for my dad getting me started as a kid, I don't know where I'd be. You know, like I said, I owe it to a lot of mentors. Mentorship is so huge. You know, these bee clubs like this are such a big important deal because they keep people up to date. They give you questions, or excuse me, answers to your questions. And without it, you know, we're just a small pool of people, and it's no different than, you know, if we have to fight the chemical companies that are killing our bees or whatever. It's such a small army against a big army. It's all based on money, and the beekeeping industry just doesn't have enough of it. And so I hope with what's going on in the industry today, with all the bee loss we're seeing, I hope it catches the attention of our country, and I hope things get done about it. I hope the testing that's taking place figures out what's going on. Hopefully there's extra funding out there for beekeepers because it's not cheap. I mean, if I had to replace all my hives, it'd cost me hundreds and thousands of dollars. I mean, it's not cheap. And there's guys talking about millions of dollars worth of bees that are dead. I think right now it's estimated at $223 million worth of dead bees right now. And that's terrible. I mean, that's a lot of money to make up for. And there's only so many government programs. We got ELAP, there's NAP, you know, but that's about it. So there's not a lot of help, you know, out there. So, you know, we got to kind of stick together here and keep the bees alive. So.